We will begin our program now. Hope everyone has enjoyed their food. If I could have your attention. One other announcement that I forgot to make, all of your lunches, if you include the Plus Plus and the $5 to the military charities that we support, comes to about $25. And like I said, $5 of that go to the military charities. We did give, thanks to your $5 donations, they do add up. We did give a $925 check in December to Veteran Scholarships Forever, a Greenville-based foundation that helps veterans with vocational education to get a job as they transition into civilian life. And we gave another $925 check to Upstate Warrior Solution, which is a Greenville-based organization that helps returning veterans reintegrate into civilian life. These two checks bring the total donations from your $5 per head that we have made to military-related charities, those two and others that we have supported, to $21,850. That's just incredible. So give yourself a hand. Pleased to introduce today's speaker. Eric Schweitzer was a captain in the United States Air Force Medical Service Corps from 1969 to 1973. He, in the early part of his career, did domestic medical evacuation duties, covering incidents such as Hurricane Camille and other things as they hit the United States. But in January 1971, he was assigned to the 9th Aeromedical Group at Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines, and from that location provided medivac throughout Southeast Asia, including Vietnam. Latter part of 1971, he was assigned to reactivate the medivac detachment in Cam Ranh Bay and later spent some time in Da Nang. He received the Air Medal for more than 30 combat missions flying medivac, and he will, as you hear, he will later was involved in the bringing our POWs home. Eric left service, attended law school, practiced law in South Carolina until his retirement in December of 2014. He and his wife Sandra live in Greenville with their two dogs, Isabel and TZ. So Eric, come on up. Please give him a hand.
I'm supposed to hook up both of these. You got that one on?
Yes, that was.
Wired for sound. Can you hear me? Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. Although it was nearly 44 years ago, if you can imagine, Operation Homecoming, as Laurence Olivier said in the movie Gigi, yes, I remember it well. My wife would disagree with my description of the accuracy of my memory, so we have Bill Austin here to correct me when I go astray, as Bill was in the penthouse suite of the Hanoi Hilton for in excess of 5 years. First, a little background. In 1970, I was at Maxwell Air Force Base in Montgomery, Alabama. I'd been there for just a few short months after a medical service corps school in Texas. Actually, one of the first things I did was, as Bob said, we responded to Hurricane Camille. That was about 3 weeks after I reported to Maxwell. I was with a detachment of the 375th Aeromedical Airlift Wing that was headquartered at Scott Air Force Base. And I was a 22-year-old green as grass second lieutenant. Fortunately for me and everyone else, I had a fabulous first sergeant, Chief Master Sergeant Casey, who took good care of me, showed me the ropes, and kept my green as grass butt out of most of the serious trouble. But one morning, I remember it was a clear early morning, early spring at Maxwell. I was waiting for a C-141 medivac flight that was coming in. I knew it had a heavy patient load. Of course, I had all the paperwork. We were expecting this flight. I knew the number of patients, litter patients, ambulatory patients. I knew a lot of these patients had been seriously wounded. I knew which ones were going to get off at Maxwell and be taken to local hospitals, and which ones were going on to be delivered to hospitals near their home up and down the East Coast. The next stop for the flight was in Andrews Air Force Base. So as the plane taxied in, and our office was right on the flight line, it stopped in front of our office, I gathered up an armload of paperwork, the medical records, everything that I needed to discuss with the medical crew. I knew what medicines they had, I knew how many meals they needed for the next leg of the flight, and I rambled up the steps and talked with the crew chief and the medical crew. And then I did what I always did. The plane was going to be on the ground for a couple of hours, refueling and getting meals, et cetera. We were offloading some patients. And so I did what I always did, is I walked down the aisles of the airplane. The C-141 had 2 aisles the way it was configured, and I talked to the patients. And I went from one to another. And all of a sudden, everything that I'd read in this paperwork that I'd been reviewing and carrying with me became more than real. There were 13 multiple traumatic amputees on this flight among the wounded. If you don't know what that means there were 13 young men that had arms and legs shot off or blown off. There were people who had lost eyes. There were people who had suffered horrible third-degree burns over large portions of their body, would be scarred for life if they survived. I don't remember any minor injuries on this flight. I remember talking to a young man. I was walking down the aisle. He was one of the first I ran into, who had been an avid snow skier before he was drafted. He's probably 18 years old. Now he had no legs. So I stopped and talked with him, and I told him about one of the ski resorts in Colorado that worked with people missing limbs. They had special equipment, and they worked with these people so they could enjoy the sport again. And this young man smiled and thanked me for this information profusely. And I walked on down the aisle. Each patient, frankly, seemed more terrible than the one before I had met. So I deplaned when it was time to go, and the crew buttoned up the aircraft, began taxiing out, and I went inside, filled out some forms, and called my counterpart, the Medical Service Corps officer at Andrews, told him the plane was leaving, and what to expect. ETA. About that time, Sergeant Casey walked up to me. I didn't have an office, I just had a desk. He walked up, and he said, "Lieutenant." Actually, he called me Lieutenant. He said, "Lieutenant, it's time for you to go home." This was, it was probably 10 o'clock in the morning, maybe 11:15. I said, "What are you talking about?" "No, it's not." He said, "We don't have any more flights today. Go home." Well, one thing I had learned was when Sergeant Casey told me to do something, even though I was a lieutenant, I did it. So I left, and I drove to my BOQ, Bachelor Officers Quarters, and went in and sat there for a few minutes. The Officers Club at Maxwell was less than 100 yards from the BOQ building. So I got up and walked over to the Officers Club and walked into the bar. I ordered a double martini, gin martini on the rocks with 3 olives. It cost 35 cents. I sat down at the bar and slowly began drinking this martini, looking in the long mirror that was behind the bar, wondering what kind of hell our young men were going through in Vietnam. Sergeant Casey was a very wise man. He saw something that I didn't realize for a long time, which was total shock. As Bob said, in early January of '71, I was transferred to Clark, the 9th Aeromedical Evacuation Group, later reopened the medivac detachment at Cameron Bay. where I spent most of my time in country. For those of you that got to visit this wonderful place, Cameron Bay was where you wanted to be if you were going to be over there. We didn't have many rocket attacks. They had a good old club. They had a nice beach. I never went to, but I saw it. And what we did at Clark, very simply, was we flew missions from Clark to Vietnam. Usually we go to Tan Son Nhut at Saigon, Da Nang, Cam Ranh Bay. Then we fly on to Thailand, and we go to 2 or 3 bases in Thailand. Then we go to Taiwan and pick some more people up in Taiwan. And then we go to Okinawa, usually to offload people. Okinawa had a big hospital, and we'd offload some of the people there. And then we'd fly to Japan and offload the rest of the people there because they had large hospitals. The next day, the same crew, we'd fly and make 5, 6 stops in Korea, picking up patients there, bringing them back to Japan. And on the 3rd day, we would fly back to Clark. We'd deadhead back with an empty airplane. Very briefly, we flew regular missions like what I just described. We flew that mission twice a week. We also flew priority missions, which meant the patient needed to be moved pretty quick. You know, they couldn't wait around for the next regular bus, if you will. And then we also had urgent missions, and they're just exactly what they sound like. They were urgent. That patient needed to be moved as quickly as humanly possible. So we were always on standby. We could launch an urgent mission in 45 minutes or an hour or less if we were prepared, depending on what kind of special equipment was needed to get that patient moved right away. So, by the way, Air Force Medical Service Corps officers, there's a difference between the Air Force MSCs and the Army MSCs. We were operations officers. We planned missions. You know, we planned what patient was going to be picked up, taken where, how long that patient might be able to tolerate being en route, what kind of medical equipment was needed, the whole bit. We were operations officers. We flew on the missions also to be sure everything went the way it was supposed to go. It usually did, but not always. If it was a very, very heavy mission, then we did what anybody would do. If the nurses and the medical technicians were overwhelmed, we jumped in and frankly, we provided patient care. We took vital signs, you know, we gave injections, held urinals, whatever it took to get the job done, to get those patients delivered and cared for en route. Army Medical Service Corps officers were something else. These were the guys that flew the Huey missions, the dust-off chopper missions into the battle zone to pick up the wounded, often while the fighting was still going on. And these guys put their lives on the line every single day, every single mission. Some of the gutsiest men I've ever been around. I flew with one. This was actually in Japan at the time, but we took off and we're flying wherever we're going. Got to talking to him. He'd been shot down 3 times, had lost 2 co-pilots. Kind of wish he'd told me that before we took off. But it was what it was. Operation Homecoming, I was asked a little bit earlier, how long did we plan for Operation Homecoming? We planned for a long time. If you remember, peace talks went on and on for a long time and were not ultimately resolved. They fell apart sometime towards the end of '72. And so President Nixon ordered the resumption of the bombing of Hanoi and Haiphong to get their attention and let them know we were serious. And we had been planning for the release prior to that time. There had been word that POWs, at least some of the POWs, might be released in Paris. So our European medivac counterparts got prepared and were all ready for that, and then of course it didn't happen. We were told that they would be released in Laos. So we got ready, and I remember flying to the Thailand-Laos border, and of course it didn't happen there either. There were a lot of false starts while this was going on. Now, with the resumption of the bombing in December of '72, we started losing B-52 crews. And no disrespect to anybody, but some moron, probably a politician, decided our B-52 should come in from the same direction at the same altitude at the same time of day for these missions. So the North Vietnamese would check their watch, walk out, send some SAMs up because they knew where they were. And so the number of POWs started going up. You're not supposed to lose B-52 crews. At least that was the way it used to be. But anyway, so there were pressures from all sides. We were actually adding people to the Hilton. We didn't need to be doing that. Finally, the peace talks were successful in January of 73. Prior to that time, we'd been going to briefings by flight surgeons, dietitians, the whole bit, trying to learn what we could to be prepared for the POWs when we got them. We didn't know what their medical condition was. We knew there were supposedly 591 POWs, the bulk of which were at the Hanoi Hilton. But we knew almost nothing about their medical condition. We knew some were not ambulatory. We knew some had suffered all sorts of broken bones and other injuries, but we really didn't know on a person-by-person basis much at all about their condition. We knew they had been tortured, starved, mentally abused, isolated, treated worse than you can possibly imagine. So we spent months and months trying to figure out what can we do and how can we best take care of these folks once we get them on board. I must digress just momentarily. Earlier in 1972, many of you will remember that Jane Fonda and Donald Sutherland took a trip to Hanoi. They got there before I did. And they engaged in all sorts of anti-America, anti-war activities, which the POWs will tell you did not make their life easier. And the North Vietnamese told us later was of great help to negotiating our pullout of the Vietnam conflict. What you may not know is that Fonda and Sutherland, on their way back to the United States, stopped in the Philippines. And they put on anti-America skits in my hometown of Angeles City, Philippines. I went to it. And sure enough, they put on these skits depicting Americans abusing and torturing and killing Filipinos and urging them to revolt. Well, I was outraged. I came from a long military family. Father, grandfather, goes back to the Civil War. I was absolutely outraged. I had partaken of a few San Miguel beers. That was the local beer. And so my inhibitions were not what they normally might have been. Having heard enough, I heaved ho with a San Miguel beer bottle, aiming at Jane Fonda. Unfortunately, where they were doing this, there was this pond, and the stage was a little peninsula in the pond, and it was just out of reach. Bottle splashed down in front. I tried again, splashed down in front. And I played on the base softball team. I thought I had a pretty good arm. Well, a lot of people decided they felt similarly to me, and all of a sudden it was raining Sammy Magoo beer bottles at Jane and Donald. Well, some MPs came trotting over. They really didn't want a full-scale riot on their hands, so they politely sort of asked me to leave. I was in civilian clothes, and I did as they told me. Being arrested not being one of the things I wanted to remember my time in the Philippines. Political statement: if it were up to me, I'd prosecute Fonda and Sutherland for their treason today, and I'd demand the maximum penalty. But I've talked to a number of POWs, and they have seen fit to forgive those at whose hands they suffered. They're better men than I am, but they have, and there's some peace to all in that. Now, Operation Homecoming, as has been stated, there were 3 missions, but each mission involved 3 C-141s. At least that's how I remember it. I was with the 3rd mission. I think Bill went out on the 2nd, if I'm not mistaken. 14 March. I think I went in on the last one in the end of March. I flew in, I was part of the advance team. We called it the Advon team. We flew in a C-130. We had the colonel that was going to receive the POWs, and we had some medical people. But we flew in early to get everything ready, so when the release ceremony took place, it would go off the way it was. We were escorted in by Russian MiGs on each wingtip, and landed early in the morning to get ready for the final release. This was the last of the POWs going out. So I hopped off the airplane and looked around and looked at one end of the tarmac, and I saw some strange looking airplanes, so I didn't recognize. They were partially covered with tarps. So I whipped out, do you all remember Brownie Instamatic cameras? Well, I whipped out my Brownie Instamatic and started clicking away. And about 10 seconds later, I was surrounded by a bunch of NVAs with their rifles pointed at me, and they were yelling. I don't know what they said. It didn't sound nice. I had one of my med techs who did speak fluent Vietnamese, and he walked over and he said, "Lieutenant, they're not very happy with you taking those pictures. They're demanding your camera." And I played dumb for a bit. Wasn't that hard. And then I turned around and with an overhand threw my camera in the back of the C-130. And I had my sergeant say, "That's United States property, you can't go on board." And they didn't. And they didn't shoot me. I think the only reason they didn't is because Walter Cronkite was standing nearby. Other than that, I think perhaps they might have. Walter Cronkite, by the way, towered above the North Vietnamese. He was a big guy. I don't know if any of you ever saw him. He's huge. He was twice as big as the largest North Vietnamese person there. I mean, he was like the Jolly Green Giant. But I'm glad he was there. So anyway, we met with the North Vietnamese, the release party, if you will, and we worked out the logistics. Of course, since this was the last of the 3 missions, we had protocol, and we kind of knew what to expect. We worked them out, and then they insisted we go to a banquet in celebration of the occasion. And so we went into one of the few buildings on the flight line that hadn't been bombed out by our bombers and sat down and had a banquet. I don't know what they served us. There was a lump of gray boiled meat. I don't want to know what kind of animal it came from, but we ate in silence while their top officer and our top officer chatted with one another through the interpreters. The release went exactly as planned. And that's what we wanted to happen. Once it was a go, we called the first of the 3 circling C-141s. We kept them out of North Vietnamese airspace until we got the thumbs up, and we called them, and the first one landed, taxied in and got ready. And then they brought the POWs to the release site in these old beat up buses. I mean, it's amazing they even ran. Our POWs filed out, formed up in columns of 2, and stood at attention while the release ceremony took place. And the release ceremony, frankly, as I remember it, was a North Vietnamese Army general giving a speech about the criminal invasion of his country by America, the atrocities committed by us to their otherwise peaceful land. And then it was over, and they began calling the POWs one by name. They stepped forward, saluted the North Vietnamese officer, did a right face, took a couple of steps, saluted our top officer, who was a colonel, a full colonel as I recall. And then they took a couple more steps to us. And we were lined up between the release site and the C-141. And because this was the last of the releases, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of media folks present, news people, cameramen, reporters, and they were shoving and and knocking people around and all that. And so that our POWs could make it out to the airplane unmolested, we all linked arms like this so to make a pathway. While we had been preparing for all of the physical needs as best we could of the POWs, representatives from all branches of the military had been preparing for all the other needs of the POWs. They were called liaisons. And each POW had at least one liaison assigned, and that person had spent months learning everything they possibly could about the POW. Family, finances, health, the whole bit. They had studied everything they could get their hands on. So when the POW came to us, he was greeted by the liaison, greeted by us, called by name, Bill, welcome home. And then they were ours. And they were escorted out to the airplane. It sounds very mechanical. And it was. We didn't want glitches. We didn't want anything out of the ordinary to happen. We wanted to get our people and get out. But it's also, without question, the most emotional experience I've ever gone through. When our POWs got off that bus, they looked like robots. No expression, nothing. They were as stone-faced as anything you could imagine. They stood at attention. They were stone-faced, like robots, saluting the officers. And then they turned to us, and we got to call them by name and say, welcome home, give them to their liaison, and show them the airplane. And there was a physical, palpable change in each and every one of these individuals. You could see it, you could feel it. It emanated from them. It was like everything they'd been holding the entire time of their capture melted. I'll never forget it. It made an impression on me that I will never forget. And for the first time in probably a long time, I smiled and walked out, because they were looking at that big airplane with a big red cross on the tail, the American flag on the tail, and a bunch of smiling GIs. And they walked out to the airplane. So when the third batch was on the airplane, I flew with the third batch out. I didn't go out on the C-130. I flew with them. We closed up as quick as we could. We taxied out as quick as we could, poured the power to the engines, and took off as quick as we could. And when wheels were up, it was real quiet up to then. The wheels were up, and there was an outburst of applause and cheering and yelling and smiling like people who hadn't been free in a long time only can do. I remember as we were pulling out, we hadn't been airborne for 30 seconds, and I noticed there were these two guys looking out a window. And I went over, I said, what are you looking at? They were a B-52 crew. They said, well, we were looking to see if we hit our target before we were shot down. Now you talking about be committed to the mission. They were committed. And I think they concluded, because there wasn't much less standing at GLOM, I think they concluded they had hit their target. So we flew back, and they wanted to talk. Of course, a lot of them spent almost the entire time talking to their liaison. They wanted to know about their family, their loved ones, the whole bit. And you understand that. Some of them, amazingly, they want to talk to our flight nurses. I can't imagine. In fact, the flight nurses were right distracted through that whole flight. We flew back to Clark. I think they drank every drop of coffee that we had on that airplane, hot coffee. My recollection is we didn't feed them, which I thought was rather odd. Bill, I don't know if you remember, but I don't think we fed them. So at one point in the planning, this is a digression also, some Air Force dietitian types decided, they've been on a really, really bland diet. Let's don't give them real food right away. Let's start them off with something real bland. Well, that lasted about 10 minutes when the first group of POWs got to the hospital at Clark. And I think there was a very polite, oh, hell no, we're not eating pumpkin soup again. So anyway, we flew to Clark and landed, and there was a huge crowd there waiting. And I've got some video that I'd like for you to see. It's not very long at all. There are actually two little clips of video. They're sort of in reverse order of what I'd like. One is the homecoming at Clark, and one is actually the release ceremony at GLOM. So I have to take one of these off. I'm going to try to run this. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to play the portion that was at Clark, the release, and then I have to skip over a little bit, and then I'm going to go to the part in Hanoi.
Loosened up back against that.
By the way, my office was right beneath the control tower.
Major Harold Johnson of Bladensburg, Iowa.
Very.
I hope I'm doing this right.
He won an Air Force Clause.
Did he?
Yeah, his front seater.
Major Harold.
That's not where this is supposed to have taken me. There's another clip that was supposed to be right after that. That was actually of the release ceremony. We played it earlier when we were setting this up, but that's not it.
Major Harold Johnson of Bladensburg, Iowa, was among.
I apologize. I'm not mechanically able to get it back to where it was, but it actually is a brief clip of the POWs actually being released one by one. Shows John McCain coming out and being escorted to the aircraft, etc. If anybody wants to stay afterwards, we'll get it up there and you can watch it. It's a great piece of film. But the first piece was, of course, at Clark. When that was the first. Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. That was the first flight to come in to Clark, and you can tell because you saw the ambulance had pulled up to the aft end of the C-141 because we had POWs that couldn't walk, and they were taken off by litters, in litters, and put on the bus, taken to the hospital. I will tell you that those who could not walk saluted the American flag from their litters as they were being carried off. And I'm still to this day disgusted that it's okay to deface the American flag. It meant so much to these people, and it's such an emblem of freedom for us that I have very little sympathy for those who see fit to deface it. I was very honored to be part of Operation Homecoming. It was something I'll never forget. Of course, by the way, the day after the POWs arrived, each batch of them began a debriefing process. And the emphasis was to try to find other people who had been captured that had not been released. As you all probably know, there's still a lot of MIAs unaccounted for from that conflict. And the initial round of debriefing was, do you know of anybody else that hasn't been released? Where did you see them, or where did you know they were? That sort of thing, to try to identify any others that had not been released during Operation Homecoming. For me, Operation Homecoming was the closing of a circle. The circle began when I walked on that C-141 at Maxwell Air Force Base in the early spring of 1970 and saw that plane load of young men that had been decimated, if you will. And it closed when the last POW got off the 141 at Clark and was delivered to the hospital at Clark, and we had everybody that we were going to get. It was like I'd been walking around for 3 years with a sore that hadn't healed, and it finally healed when the last of our men was in our hands and being taken care of. Operation Homecoming was a wonderful conclusion to a terrible war. I'm proud of the way our people, the flight crews, the liaisons, the nurses, the medical technicians, everybody involved, very proud of how they performed through it all. It was done professionally, with precision, and with compassion. I'm particularly proud of the way our POWs conducted themselves with dignity. Throughout that entire release ceremony, until they were in our hands, you would have been so proud of each and every one of them. Make you proud to be an American and be represented by people like that. You ask most Vietnam War POWs, I suspect they'll tell you, you know, I was just doing my job. I would do it again. As for my part, I stand in unmitigated awe of their character, their courage, their stamina, and their determination. Please join me in saluting Bill and each of the POWs that we were able to retrieve, and thank them for their duty and for their dedication. Bill. At ease. Thank you very much.
Any questions?
Yeah, any questions?
Any questions from
other
anybody?
than my obvious lack of ability to run a video machine.
Any questions from anyone? Yes?
You ever figure out what kind of plane that was? Did you take a picture of it and bring the camera?
No, I didn't, but that's another story. I'm still connected. I'm sorry. That's a very interesting story. When I got back to Clark, and the POWs were on their way to the question was, did I know what kind of airplanes I had taken pictures of in Hanoi? No, they were partially covered with tarps. But when I got to Clark, and the POWs were on the buses headed away, a non-uniformed man came up and said, "May I have your camera?" I said, "You know, what?" And he was from intelligence. And he took my camera and returned it to me, I think it was about a week later, because I still have a couple of pictures that I took on that little Brownie. In fact, I sent them to Bob. They're very poor quality. That's old 35, you remember 35 millimeter, and they're terrible quality. But one's on the airplane coming back to Clark, and one was actually from Hanoi looking at the crowd there. But those are the only pictures I got back. The pictures of the airplanes mysteriously disappeared. So. Oh my.
I started operating
I'm sorry. But no, so I don't know what they were. I'm 99% sure they were Russian, but I don't know what type of aircraft. I don't know what their designator was. Any other questions?
I had one question.
Yeah.
Is there one liaison for one prisoner, or did one liaison have more than one assigned to him?
At least one liaison per prisoner. In some cases, there were 2 liaisons for one prisoner. No, in no case that I'm aware of did a liaison have more than one POW assigned. Y'all realize so much had happened to these folks while they were in captivity. I mean, they had relatives that were ill, relatives that had passed away, divorced, they had children. Some of them had children they hadn't seen since they were infants, if at all. There were all sorts of things. Some had time and grade for promotions, back pay. I mean, you think of what happened to some of these people that were there for so long, and to reconstruct that history for them. I mean, some was good and some was not. And there were all the emotion, all the full range of emotions that you can imagine. Imagine not knowing anything about your family for 5 or 6 or 7 years, nothing. It was a very important part of the process to work with these people and share this information with them in the right manner. Yes, sir.
Eric, did we have any planes shot down in air-to-air combat over Vietnam, or was it all by ground-to-air missiles?
Denver.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm not the best to answer that.
Yeah, we did.
I can promise you several airplanes shot down. I was on a flight that we lost. Squadron commander, first mission.
In air-to-air?
Air to air, yes. Their tactic was to come up behind you. They didn't have a forward firing missile like we did, like the 87. So they were positioned to come up behind you to shoot you down.
Right.
Which they stole from the Americans completely.
Yeah.
Several aircraft were shot down. Randy Cunningham, like the first ace in the Navy, was shot down.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
How long do those liaison officers stay in contact with those POWs?
I don't know. Bill might know. Liaison officer, how long were you with the liaison?
I didn't have one.
Oh, you didn't have one. Well, I
My
stand
liaison-
corrected then.
My liaison officer was a very pretty, blue-eyed, blonde-haired nurse.
I was going to say hallelujah. Yeah. Somebody lucked out. I don't know the answer to that. I know that they were there at Clark, of course, in Hanoi for the flight back, and at Clark with them for a period of time. We were trying to get them back to the States as quickly as we could. If their medical condition warranted, we were trying to get them home as quickly as possible. Bo, you had a question?
Yeah, when did we initially find out the names of the prisoners? Pretty much immediately when they were captured?
Well, we knew a number of them when they were captured. When we got the final list of the 591 was before the peace talks were over, but how much before that, I don't know. My focus was mainly the medical handling of these people once we got them. Some of those logistics, are being handled by others. Yeah.
I can answer that. Seaman Doug Hedgel was washed off of the back of a destroyer at night out in the Gulf of Tonkin and managed to stay afloat until a Vietnamese boat picked him up thinking he was a Navy SEAL and brought him in. He wasn't. He was just a seaman. But he came in and was integrated with the rest of the POWs. We all had all of the known POWs we had them in alphabetical order. We'd alphabetize them in our minds when they were shot down and died on them and everything. And so he had that complete list. Well, about the third group that the Vietnamese, in good graces and everything, sent home, they offered him the opportunity to go. And so he went to his senior ranking officer and told him that he'd been offered to go. And Colonel Guy said, "You have all the names. You have done nothing wrong. You say nothing wrong against our government, and go." And he did. And so that's when the names came out. A lot of the names that people thought were dead. There were wives that had already remarried and
Right.
everything that didn't know their husbands were up there, you know, thought they were dead. So he brought the names out, and that was when my name came out officially and everything, that they knew I was alive. But that was 4 years after I was shot down.
Right.
So he brought the names out. That's where they got the most of the names.
Right. A lot of the POWs, you know, we were uncertain about. We knew some had been shot down, we knew some had been captured on land, but knowing which had survived and which had not was a problem. And there were also some who had been captured who were killed during captivity and of course not released. So that's, you know, that's what I knew about the people. I had a manifest. In fact, my job doesn't sound like a whole lot, frankly, but on that last mission, my job, I had a list of them, and I was supposed to check them off. We did not want to leave Hanoi and not have everybody on board the airplane. You know, so when they would release a POW, they'd say, you know, Bill Austin. I'd look down, check. That was my big job, was to be sure. And when it was all done, I said, hey, Colonel, we got them all. And that's when we left.
Any other questions? Eric, I want to thank you for your service. Thank you for the hundreds, perhaps thousands of service members that you returned to their lives. Thanks for all that you did during your 4 years of service. Thanks for being with us. Let's give Eric and also Bill another round of applause.